I found the photograph on a grey afternoon that smelled faintly of rain and mildew, the kind of day where time feels slower inside archives. I'd been alone in the University of Edinburgh's image restoration lab for nearly 7 hours, cataloguing a shipment of glass negatives and cabinet cards recently donated from the Abernathy estate collection. Most of the images were unremarkable: pastoral scenes, wedding portraits, funerals, a few group photos of rural families in Aberdeenshire. But then, near the bottom of the final box, I saw it. The photograph was large, 8 by 10 inches, mounted on stiff grey card, a family portrait, 10 figures in total. The matting had yellowed with age, and one corner had warped from damp storage, but the image itself was astonishingly clear. A woman in black silk sat at the centre, her posture proud, hands clasped neatly in her lap. To her right, a bearded man with the kind of face carved by a lifetime outdoors. Behind them stood 4 young adults, 2 men and 2 women, all stiff-backed, solemn, their expressions betraying that typical Victorian mixture of pride and fatigue. And in front of the seated pair, 2 children, a girl perhaps 7 years old and another a little older, hands folded as if in imitation of their mothers. The photograph was perfectly balanced, almost painterly in composition, except for one thing. To the far right, half in shadow, sat another man. His clothes didn't fit. Where the others wore formal wool and fitted bodices, his coat hung loose and shapeless, the fabric darker, almost indistinct. His boots were scuffed, the laces untied, and his hands, thin, long-fingered, rested too still on his knees, as if placed there deliberately after the fact. The strangest part, though, was his face. His features were oddly blurred, not in motion blur or focus error, but as though they hadn't belonged to the same exposure at all. I adjusted the light. No change. I removed the magnifying lens. Same result. His skin tone was paler than the others, almost translucent, and his eyes, where the rest of the family's gazes were fixed dutifully forward, seemed to stare just past the lens, unfocused, like someone looking at something behind the camera. At first, I assumed he was simply a visiting relative, or perhaps an artifact of double exposure, a common flaw in old gelatin prints. But as I logged the accession number and typed Family Portrait Unidentified Group 1890, I noticed something odd in the accompanying notes from the estate donor. Provenance: the Abernathy family, Invercald Parish, Aberdeenshire. Photographer: J. Murdoch, Stonehaven. Notes: taken posthumously following death of patriarch, winter 1889. I frowned. Posthumously. In early photography, it wasn't uncommon to include the recently deceased in a mourning portrait. Sometimes the photographer would paint open eyes over the lids or prop the subject upright with braces, a macabre attempt at preservation. But there was no indication this image was one of those. The lighting was natural, the family alive and poised. Still, the word sat like a pebble under my tongue. I turned the print over. On the back, someone had scrawled a note in fading ink. The last taken before he returned. Returned. That single word unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. I set the photograph aside for scanning, though my hand lingered a moment longer than necessary. I told myself it was professional interest, composition, exposure, the charm of an authentic 19th century rural study. But deep down, it felt like something else. The image had weight. That evening, I digitized the print using the lab's high-resolution scanner. The process was routine, one I could almost do blindfolded. Clean the glass bed, align the edges, adjust the histogram curve, enhance contrast. But when the scan appeared on the monitor, I froze. The digital image revealed details the original print had obscured: fine grain, fabric weave, even dust motes suspended in air. But the man, the one sitting far right, appeared different. Up close, His face wasn't merely blurred, it was semi-transparent. The wood grain of the wall behind him bled faintly through the curve of his jaw. His collar faded into shadow, and his hands, impossibly, cast no shadow at all. Every other figure in the image did. Even the little girl's ribbons produced delicate twin silhouettes. But his, nothing. I zoomed closer. His pupils were pale, like glass marbles, reflecting no light. Then I saw something else. In the lower corner of the photograph, just beneath his chair, faint scratches had been etched into the emulsion, barely perceptible even under enhancement. I rotated the image, magnified again. They weren't random lines. They formed letters, 3, maybe 4 words, almost invisible. He wasn't in the room. I sat back. My pulse thudded in my ears. I checked the metadata. Nothing. The note wasn't logged, no mention of any inscription. Yet there it was, clear as ink. Someone, decades ago, had carved that warning into the photograph. I left the lab late that night. The corridor outside smelled of floor polish and dust. My footsteps echoed sharply in the narrow space. I told myself the inscription was probably the work of a nervous relative or prankster, some descendant who'd inherited the photograph and let superstition fill the blanks. But when I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The man's posture, his expression, that strange sentence. He wasn't in the room. At around midnight, I opened my laptop and zoomed in once more on the scan. I studied each face carefully, cross-referencing with the estate registry. 9 Abernathys were recorded as residents in 1890. Father, mother, 4 children, 2 adult sons, and a widowed aunt. That made 9. The photograph showed 10. 10, meaning one person didn't belong. I cross-checked the image again. The old man on the far right, the one with the indistinct features, did not appear in any family record. No birth certificate, no death record, no mention of a relative matching his age or description. And yet, there he was, seated calmly among them, as if he'd always been part of the family. The next morning, I went to the Rare Collections office. The archivist on duty was an elderly woman named Margaret, a fixture of the department, sharp as frost and twice as cold to undergraduates. "Ah, Thorne," she said as I approached her desk. "Still chasing ghosts?" I managed a smile. This one might actually be one. Her eyebrow lifted. I explained. The photo, the extra figure, the etched words. She listened, unimpressed, until I mentioned the Abernathy name. Then she grew thoughtful. "The Abernathys of Invercargill," she murmured. That family had peculiar history. I leaned forward. "You know them?" "Only by record. There was a tragedy, if I recall correctly. Winter of 1890. Whole household found dead in their home after a blizzard. They said the youngest daughter opened the door to someone claiming to be a neighbor. By morning, the family was gone. Gone how? Her lips thinned. Frozen, apparently. Every one of them seated upright around the hearth. No sign of struggle, no intruder. Fire burned out. The local paper called it the quiet sleep. I swallowed. What happened to the house? Condemned. Torn down in the 1920s. I hesitated before asking. Did the report mention anyone else there? Anyone who didn't belong? She gave me a look. No, but superstitions took root afterward. Locals said a stranger had been seen walking the fields near Invercargill that winter. Tall man, grey coat, didn't speak. They called him the lodger. Her gaze sharpened. "Why do you ask?" I hesitated, then decided honesty was useless here. "Just research context." She leaned back, her chair creaking. "If you're digging through that box, keep gloves on. We don't need another contamination complaint." I thanked her and left, but her words followed me all the way back to the lab. The Lodger. The title struck something deep and unpleasant, like memory half remembered from a dream. That evening, I began scanning the rest of the Abernathy photographs. Most were standard: barns, livestock, Christmas gatherings. But the deeper I went into the box, the more the tone shifted. In one image, the children stood in front of the farmhouse, faces blurred, as if they'd been photographed while moving. In another, the same window reflected a figure standing behind the photographer. The reflection was faint, distorted, but familiar. Tall, coat collar high, face indistinct. And then I found something that shouldn't have existed. A glass negative, unlabeled, wrapped in old parchment. It was cracked down one side, but the image, once inverted digitally, was unmistakable. The same family, same setting, but their arrangement had changed. This time the old man sat at the center. Everyone else faced him, their expressions somber, their bodies rigid as if in restraint. The light came from behind them, harsh and cold. And through that light, something like smoke, a faint mist rising from the old man's shoulders. Under magnification, the mist wasn't random. It spiraled outward, curling like breath, or steam, as though the air itself were reacting to his presence. I saved the scan and labeled it Abernathy_variant02.tif, but my hands were trembling too much to steady the keyboard. That night, I dreamed of the photograph, except the figures were moving. The old man turned his head slowly toward me, his mouth barely parting, and whispered something I couldn't hear. When I woke, the lights in my flat were on, and my laptop, which I'd left closed, was open on my desk. The photograph filled the screen. Only now there were 11 figures. I didn't tell anyone about the 11th figure. I couldn't. Saying it aloud would have made it real. Instead, I buried myself in research, old newspapers, parish records, even handwritten ledgers in the National Library. The Abernathy quiet sleep incident appeared only once, in a local paper dated January 1890. The tone was clinical. On the morning of January 17th, the bodies of 9 members of the Abernathy family were discovered in their home by a parish constable responding to reports of smoke. No marks of violence were present. Cause of death is presumed to be asphyxiation from the hearth fire. There was one additional sentence at the end. Neighbors recall seeing a man unknown to the district enter the home on the previous evening. His description remains inconsistent. No follow-up article. No investigation. I visited the local records office in Invercold. The clerk, a quiet man with nicotine-stained fingers, looked up from his desk when I mentioned the name. "Ah, the Abernathys," he said softly, as though speaking it too loudly might wake something. "They don't come up often." I asked if the property still existed. He hesitated, then pulled an old township map from a drawer. A small red circle marked Abernathy Farmstead near the river bend, a good 5 miles outside the current village boundary. "Technically private land now," he said, "but no one's lived there since before the war." I should have stopped there. Should have left the past buried under frost and superstition. But by then, curiosity had already turned into obsession. I drove out the next morning. The road wound through empty moorland, the snow falling in slow, deliberate spirals. By the time I reached the river, the sky had dimmed to pewter. The farmhouse was barely visible through the fog, a collapsed skeleton of wood and stone, its roof half-caved, door hanging open like a broken jaw. Inside, everything smelled of damp earth. My flashlight caught fragments of what once was: rusted bed frames, shattered crockery, a child's shoe half buried in the dust. In the main room, the hearth still stood, blackened and cold. That's when I saw it. Above the mantel, carved into the soot-black stone, were initials: E.A. Eric Abernathy, the patriarch. Beside them, almost hidden under years of grime, another set of letters. ML. I touched them gently. The surface was smoother, newer, as if carved after the fire. Behind me, something shifted. A faint crack of wood, the whisper of fabric brushing stone. Hello? No answer. Only the slow drip of water from the ceiling. Then my flashlight flickered. For a moment, the room brightened. And in that flicker, I saw him. A figure standing at the far end of the room, tall, shoulders stooped slightly forward. His coat hung like wet paper, his face. I blinked, and he was gone. The light steadied again, revealing only the door. I stood frozen for nearly a full minute before forcing myself to move. I took one last photograph for documentation, though my hands shook so violently the image blurred. And then I left. But when I reached my car, I noticed something in the snow behind me. Footprints. Not mine. They led from the doorway to where I'd been standing, then stopped abruptly, as though whoever had made them had simply vanished. That night, back in my flat, I transferred the photos to my computer. Most were useless, grainy, overexposed. But the last one, the one I'd taken just before leaving, made my blood run cold. In the far right of the frame, near the hearth, was a shadow darker than it should have been. Its outline was human, blurred but distinct, and in the reflection of a broken window, I could see my own face. Except I wasn't alone in the reflection. Behind me, leaning forward, was the old man from the original photograph. I stopped sleeping. Each night, I dreamed of the same scene. The Abernathy house, the family seated in silence, and that stranger standing among them, his head slowly turning toward me. I woke to faint tapping on my window, as though someone were testing the glass. Then the images began to change again. When I reopened the digital files, the figure had moved closer in each photo. In one, he was at the window. In another, just behind the family. By the last, he was staring directly at the camera. At me. I deleted them all, or tried to. Each time, the folder repopulated itself. 11 copies, always 11. I unplugged my external drive, destroyed the backup, even reformatted the hard disk. Yet the files reappeared each morning, identical except for one detail. The old man's head tilted slightly more, his mouth beginning to open. I went back to Margaret, desperate for logic. She frowned when she saw me. "You look unwell, Thorne." "I need the original photo," I said. "You already checked it out." I blinked. "What?" She slid a sign-out log across the counter. My name was written there, dated the day before. "I didn't," I began, but she interrupted with a raised hand. "It's not here. You returned it last night. That's impossible." I was home. She gave me a long, assessing look. "Perhaps you should take some rest." I left without arguing, but panic burned in my chest. I hadn't been back to the archive. I hadn't touched that photograph since the day of the discovery. So who had? The following week blurred into fragments. My phone died repeatedly. The lights in my flat flickered at random, and once, while shaving, I caught sight of something impossible in the mirror. For a split second, the reflection behind me was not my own. When I blinked, it was gone. Then, one night, I received an email from an address I didn't recognize. Subject: "He's not gone." Attached was a single file, a high-resolution scan of the Abernathy photograph. Except the image was now empty. No family, no chairs, no background. Only the old man remained, seated alone in the center of a blank grey field. Beneath him, faintly visible, were words etched in the same slanted hand as before. "He was never in the room. Now he is." I drove to Invercourt the next morning, intending to burn whatever was left of that house to the ground. But when I reached the river bend, there was nothing. No ruins, no stone foundation, only snow and the faint outline of a circle where the house had once stood. And in the middle of that circle, half buried in frost, was the original photograph. I don't know how long I stood there. When I finally bent to pick it up, the paper was dry, untouched by weather. The image had changed again. The old man sat front and center as before. But this time, there was someone beside him. Me. That's where the police found my car 2 days later. Engine still running. Headlights pointed toward an empty field. The photograph was on the passenger seat. And when the technicians examined it, they counted 12 figures. No one has been able to explain how that's possible. But sometimes, late at night, when the lights flicker and my computer hums to life by itself, a window opens. A faint grey image appearing for only a moment before vanishing again. 10 faces frozen in time, one stranger, and one I know all too well, looking straight out, still waiting to be counted.